In one of the most famous churches in the world, the grave of a king went missing. How does that even happen? How did we lose the corpse of James I for over 200 years? And how, why, and most importantly, where did we find him again? In this Stuart history documentary, we look at the death, very elaborate funeral, and ultimately the missing grave of the first Stuart King of England, aka James VI of Scotland. I'll also tell you why he's buried where he is and whose grave he kind of stole. I'll be showing you pictures of his coffin too, along with two other very famous royals, just in case you're into that kind of thing. James was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, and he was born in 1566. In 1567, he became James VI of Scotland when his mother was forced to abdicate, and he ultimately inherited the crown of his fairly distant cousin, Elizabeth I of England, in 1603, and as a result is often known as James I as well. During the course of his English reign, he lost several of his children, including his heir, Prince Henry, who died in 1612 at the age of 18, and his wife, Anne of Denmark, who died in 1619. All were interred in Westminster Abbey, in the large and imposing chapel of Henry VII, where James had also had his mother's remains relocated in 1612 from her original resting place in Peterborough Cathedral, where she had been buried after her execution in 1587. James's own death was fairly unpleasant, as these things go. His health was already weakened due to his age, poor diet, the loss of his teeth, which meant that he couldn't chew his food and affected his digestion, his overindulgence in alcohol, and his massive weight gain. For years already, he'd had blood in his urine, which also burnt when he passed it, arthritis, kidney stones, and attacks of diarrhea, gout, vomiting, and melancholy. He fell ill for the final time at Theobald's Palace in early March 1625, with what was termed a tertian ague, marked by intermittent fevers and shivering fits. He refused to do as his doctors ordered, as he had always had little patience with the profession, saying that it relied on, quote, mere conjecture, which are uncertain and therefore invalid. And I think we can all agree, gang, that he was spot on, and the fact that he didn't do what his doctors said might have even kept him alive for as long as he survived. Had his grandson, Charles II, been less willing to do what his medical men said, he actually might have survived his final illness, or at the very least not have died in as much pain as he did. Despite not allowing some of the more extreme treatments, in inverted commas, recommended to him though, James continued to deteriorate. After 3 attacks of tertian ague, his breathing became laboured and his pulse erratic. Only at this point did the king succumb to the pleas of his courtiers to do what the doctors said, and allowed himself to be bled with leeches and given purgatives. I'm not a doctor, but I can pretty much guarantee they won't have helped. James deteriorated, suffering more prolonged fits and an even worse pulse and breathing. A swollen throat made it difficult to even swallow water. The blood loss from leeching won't have helped this, as that will have dehydrated and weakened him even faster, and he began slipping in and out of consciousness. When he was awake, he had horrendous diarrhea, needing his privy stool over 30 times in a single 24-hour period. His religious advisors sat with him, reading him scripture and fortifying him against the death they all knew was coming. They marvelled at the strength of his convictions and patience with his pain. Even when his speech failed him, he could still raise his eyes to acknowledge that he heard their words. The end was close now, however, and one first-hand account of it describes how, against hope and contrary to reason, the fit attacked with great fierceness, with both a long and horrible chill and a cruel fire. As his weaker strengths were no match for so unequal an antagonist, after a long and difficult fight, they wholly succumbed. His speech failed him, and so did his pulse, and with very many black ejections and a diaphoretic sweat, a conflict in which he had endured for almost 40 hours and held on with every aid, finally the most pious soul of the king, the most prudent, the most just, and the most Christian of all kings, flew away from this earthly prison, not without the greatest grief and the most profuse tears of all his people, towards Jesus Christ the Redeemer and into eternal joy, on the 27th day of March in the year of the Lord, 1625. There were rumours that he'd been poisoned by his favourite, the Duke of Buckingham, but there is no genuine evidence of this, and in fact, such rumours are a common feature of historic royal deaths, as you can see if you watch my episode on whether Catherine of Aragon was murdered back in 1536. I'll leave that linked for you. In fact, an autopsy showed that James had a heavily damaged kidney and liver, a putrid spleen, a gallbladder, quote, scorched with bile, black liquid stinking excrement in his digestive tract, black blood in his lungs, and fatty tissue around his heart. No wonder he died. Despite being broke by royal standards, the new king, Charles I, decided to hold an elaborate and wildly expensive funeral for his father, using the opportunity to show off the supposed wealth and power of the still young Stuart dynasty, young in terms of its hold on the English throne, that is. The first step was a grand torchlit procession, somewhat dampened by the rain, to bring the corpse from Theobald's Palace to Denmark House on the evening of the 4th of April, which King Charles himself took part in. Next, the body was left there to lie in state for a month, with spectators filing by to look at the coffin and at the lifelike funeral effigy which was placed on top of it. At about 10 a.m. on the 7th of May came the pièce de résistance, another incredibly long and elaborate procession through London which ended at Westminster Abbey. During this time, the corpse was attended by thousands of mourners dressed in black. Estimates put the number anywhere from 5,000 to 9,000 people. These were members of the nobility from all across the British Isles, ambassadors representing foreign powers, plus the royal household, heralds, soldiers, musicians, and even poor men. King Charles took part too, though this was very unusual for the time period. Then, of course, there were the tens of thousands of spectators, if not more. It must have been an incredible sight, and brought London to a virtual standstill for hours and hours. The price was incredible too, coming in at between £40,000 and £50,000, depending on which estimate you read. For context, Anne of Denmark's funeral in 1619, which wasn't shabby guys and was considered very expensive on its own, came in at £20,000. One of the biggest single costs was the black cloth for draping the likes of buildings, horses, chariots, and people in mourning. That alone was a staggering £28,000. And by the way, if you want to know where I'm getting these numbers and details of the death, funeral processions, and services in general, I'll leave a book about James's death I used linked below for you, and I've also added it to my Amazon storefront. Once at the Abbey, the king's corpse was placed in a hearse and taken inside to begin the funeral service. Bishop John Williams gave the sermon, comparing James to the biblical King Solomon and praising the manner in which he had died, secure in his Protestant faith. It was only at about 7 p.m, when the service was complete, that the king was at last interred in a vault in the Henry VII Chapel, using the burial rites laid out in the Book of Common Prayer. As far as we can tell, though, no memorial, not even a nameplate, was ever put up to mark the spot, and within less than 60 years, the exact location of his grave had been forgotten. The original sources are of little help too. The Great Wardrobe accounts, which dealt with the expenses incurred in burying him, noted payments, quote, "for labour and charges in opening the vault wherein his Majesty's body is laid, and for taking down and setting up again the next partition in the choir, and divers great pews of wainscot and divers other seats." As one 19th century writer observed, these arrangements seem to point to the north aisle, where the partitions might have been removed for the sake of introducing the coffins. Nothing was certain though, and there is no useful information in the manuscripts held at the Herald's College either, which said nothing of James and of Anne of Denmark, only that she lay in, quote, "a little chapel at the bottom of the stairs leading into King Henry VII's Chapel." Meanwhile, the Abbey Register said that James was in King Henry VII's vault. Before I get to the later reports of where James lay, please remember to give the video a like and subscribe to my channel with the notification bell switched on so you never miss an upload. You can also join my YouTube membership for extra perks, or find me over on Patreon, where I release even more bonuses, including early access to ad-free videos and extra podcasts. The link is below for you, as is a link to my website, historycallingofficial.com, where you can get 2 complimentary downloads by signing up to my free mailing list. For those of you with Irish ancestry, you might also want to check out my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors, online. Details are also below. Within a generation, conflicting reports about where he lay began to appear in published works too. In 1681 or 1682, both years appear on the title page, so I'm not sure which is accurate, a book was published by Henry Keep called Monumenta Westmonasteriensia, in which he claimed that in a vault on the north side of the tomb of King Henry VII was James, King of England, Scotland, France and Ireland, interred in a chest of lead covered with black velvet, with Anne, Queen of England, his wife. A couple of decades later, in 1711, writer Jodocus Krull repeated this claim in his book The Antiquities of St. Peter's or the Abbey Church of Westminster. Then, in 1723, John Dart wrote in the first volume of his West Monasterium that James and Anne lay together in a tomb at the east end of the north aisle, noting that it had no monument. He even gave the Latin inscription apparently on the gilt copper plate on the king's coffin, which translates to "The resting place of the most invincible James I, King of Great Britain, France and Ireland, who held rule over the Scots for 59 years, 3 months and 12 days, and over the English for 22 years and 3 days. Having peacefully and happily reigned, he at last fell asleep in the Lord on the 27th day of March in the year of Christ 1625, in the true 60th year of his age." There are some errors here, for James had ruled Scotland for a little under 58 years and was in the 59th year of his age. On top of these issues, Dart wasn't sure about the location information either, for in the second volume of his book, he said that though the king and queen were together, they were in a vault by the old Duke of Buckinghamshire, 8 foot 10 inches long, 4 foot 6 inches wide, 3 foot long. It was very precise for someone who apparently couldn't even decide which story to go with. Something was clearly amiss here more generally, though, not just with Dart. Despite less than a century having passed since James's death, there was no consensus regarding the exact location of his tomb, and numerous stories had emerged about where he lay. All were agreed that he was somewhere in the Henry VII Chapel in Westminster Abbey, but that chapel is actually pretty big as these things go and contains numerous vaults and scores of corpses. James was now lost somewhere amongst them. No one thought to do anything about this issue until late 1868, when the mystery was brought to the attention of the then Dean of the Abbey, Arthur Penrhyn Stanley, by another man called Doyne Courtney Bell. He'd later be involved in disinterring Anne Boleyn's remains in the Tower of London, and I'll leave my episode all about what he found linked for you. By early 1869, with the permission of the Secretary of State and Queen Victoria, the hunt was on for the remains of James Stuart. They began with what they thought was the most likely option, opening up a vault to the northeast of the Henry VII and Elizabeth of York Memorial. However, they discovered only the coffins of the Duke of Argyll, his Duchess, and 2 of their daughters. The search continued as they moved around the chapel, now focusing on the space between the Henry and Elizabeth Memorial and the Villiers Vault. In some places, they discovered that no new vaults were present. In others, they found vaults which were empty. In one lay the remains of Oliver Cromwell's daughter, Elizabeth Claypole. They moved on to the Sheffield Chapel, which is like a sub-chapel within the Henry VII Chapel. It's still in the same room. And here they found a plain brick vault which matched the dimensions given by John Dart, and which contained the remains of Anne of Denmark, identified by her coffin plate. There was no other coffin, however, but there was a small hole bored into the side of the vault in which were discovered 2 leg bones and a piece of skull. Was this all that was left of James VI and I, wondered Stanley and his associates? Had the Cromwellian soldiers who had occupied the abbey in the 1640s destroyed his coffin and left just these fragments behind? No one knew for sure, but they weren't giving up the search for a more meaningful collection of remains just yet, and so on they went. In a vault neighbouring Queen Anne's were discovered the remains of the Sheffield family, the first Duke and Duchess of Buckinghamshire plus other members of the family. Still, there was no James. Perhaps he was with his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, they thought, and so off they went to open up her tomb as well, which, although stuffed full with members of the Stuart family, including James's son, Prince Henry, did not include the king himself. On they went. The vault of Lady Margaret Lennox was checked too, but there was no James there, nor was he buried with General Monk, while over on the other side of the chapel, a hole was made in the vault of Mary I and Elizabeth I, and it was peeked into. But those two queens have only each other for company now. See my episode all about their shared tomb to hear more about it. There was no vault in the gap between their tomb and the memorials for King James's little daughters, and the urn containing the bones of the supposed princes in the tower. There was nowhere left to go now but back to the central part of the chapel, for as Stanley said, it was now evident that the printed accounts of James's interment were entirely at fault. The whole north side of the chapel, where they with one accord represented him to have been buried, had been explored in vain. The tomb of Edward VI, which lies at the head of that of his grandparents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, was now open too, but it is tiny, barely big enough for his single coffin, and he lies there alone. Might James be in the Montpensier chapel, they wondered? Nope, though they did find the remains of an unidentified man about 6 feet tall, too tall for the missing king, in a simple earthen grave, which they surmised might be General Charles Worsley, a favourite of Oliver Cromwell's who had been buried with great state in 1656. The searchers now came to the conclusion that the only place left to look was also the most obvious. The tomb of Henry VII and his queen, which the Abbey register actually gave as the location of James's burial. Stanley explained why it had not been checked already, by saying that despite the register's information, it seemed ridiculously improbable that James was there. Most sources stated that he was elsewhere, and the flooring around the tomb looked, quote, as if always unbroken. Edward VI's tomb was in the way of an entrance to it at the head, and Stanley claimed that he and his associates were reluctant to disturb Henry and Elizabeth. From what he says, it also appears that the Abbey register he was using was written up in 1718, but I have to admit that, unless I missed something in his multi-volume work, which is entirely possible, I find his discussion of that source to be a bit lacking. I was left wondering if he was talking about a new document compiled in that year and based on a fresh survey of the tombs, or a compilation of old documents copied out again, or a mixture of both, or if he just meant that the entry for James I had been added in 1718. Probably if I had more time to research this and access to the relevant archive to go and look at the original registers myself, I could dig up an answer for you. But as I don't, let's just play it safe and assume that the entry for James dated to 1718 and was not being drawn from a much earlier book, as that would have taken precedence as a source over the other later accounts of where he lay. Now, regarding Stanley's explanations as to why the tomb of Henry VII was not looked into earlier, I have a couple of responses to those. First, though he didn't know it, the main Tudor vault had been opened at least twice since Henry VII was put into it in 1509, because it was the original resting place of Elizabeth I, who James then had moved to her current tomb with her sister in 1606. If the entry in the burial book from 1718 was based on a visual check of the contents of the tomb, it would also have had to be opened up in that year too. So the apparently perfect stonework in the floor was certainly not always unbroken. It had evidently just been very well repaired, or else the vault was accessed via Edward VI's little tomb and the damage hidden under the altar which was placed above his grave. Second, it seems laughable to me that a bunch of men who had by now rifled through nearly every other grave in the chapel, including many that had no source connecting them to James, were hesitant to break into the Tudor vault. Certainly their supposed hesitation didn't stop them from moving forwards, and in February 1869 they dug in underneath the Grand Memorial from its western side, despite the fact that this meant going in through the tiny space between Edward VI's tomb and that of his grandparents. No wonder Stanley said the way was encumbered. Given how small the gap is between the two tombs, I have no trouble imagining that Edward VI might have been disturbed every time the bigger vault next door to him had to be opened up. They discovered an entranceway with a large stone in front of it and brickwork closing up the gap at the top, and having shifted it, they opened the tomb. At last they had hit gold. Out of the gloom appeared 3 coffins. Henry VII was on the right, Elizabeth of York lay in the centre, and on the left was at last discovered the errant James I, lying where he'd evidently been put back in 1625, just as the Abbey register said. James's coffin looked a little brighter than the much older, darker receptacles holding the first Tudor King and Queen, and the men were identifiable by coffin plates and inscriptions, with Elizabeth identified by a simple process of elimination. The plate on James I's tomb was not gilt copper, as stated by Dart, and if ever such a plate existed, it must have been taken away, said Stanley, though when that would have been is beyond me, as the tomb doesn't appear to have been entered since 1625. The actual plate on the coffin was plain copper, and said, and I'm translating from the Latin, "The resting place of the most august Prince James I, King of Great Britain, France and Ireland, who was born among the Scots on the 13th day before the calends of July, meaning the 19th of June, in the year of salvation 1562, which is wrong. He was born in 1566, but I don't know if this is an error on the plate or in Stanley's transcription. He most piously died amongst the English on the 5th day before the calends of April, in the year from the birth of Christ 1625. He lived 58 years, 9 months and 8 days. He reigned over the Scots for 57 years, 7 months and 29 days, over the English 22 years and 3 days. The lead coffin had evidently been placed within a wooden one at an earlier date, which, quote, had been made out of 2 logs of solid timber which had been scooped out to receive the shape of the leaden coffin. Stanley felt that the other 2 coffins had been adjusted to make way for James's. Again, he didn't know Elizabeth I had been placed in here for 3 years first, and at that stage their outer wooden coffins, whatever was left of them, had been removed to reduce the amount of space Henry and Elizabeth of York's remains were taking up. This is unsurprising when you consider the dimensions of the vault. Made of firestone, it measures 8 feet 10 inches long, just 5 feet in width, and about 4.5 feet high. Remarkably, there was graffiti remaining from the men who had put James in his grave, for the name John Ware and the initials EC, along with the year 1625, were found scratched into his coffin, or at least I think the scratchings are on his coffin. Stanley's prose isn't very clear here. There were no urns in the vault, which was unusual given that the bodies were surely embalmed. The urns would hold the organs removed during that process, and Stanley wondered if they were in a different vault. There was no further searching for them though, and instead, with the mystery now solved, the vault was resealed with a tablet left at its entrance saying, "This vault was opened by the Dean, February 11th, 1869. Why was James buried here, though, and why was there no memorial to him? The answer to the first question has to do with dynastic reasons. James's claim to the throne was not absolute. In fact, according to the will of Henry VIII, the crown should have gone to the descendants of his younger sister, Mary Tudor Brandon, after Elizabeth's death, while James was descended from the older sister, Princess Margaret Tudor, Queen of Scotland. By having his mother moved to Westminster Abbey and a grand tomb erected for her, plus having a large monument put up for his immediate predecessor, Elizabeth I, her sister Mary may be interred with her, but she apparently didn't merit an effigy, and then having himself buried with the progenitors of the Tudor dynasty when he could have been placed with Mary, Queen of Scots, James was hammering home the links between himself and the Tudors and with England more generally. he was shoring up the claims of the Stuart family to the English crown, and it is for these reasons that I think he wanted Elizabeth I out of that tomb so that he could nab her spot in it. Interestingly, apart from a rather small memorial to his infant daughters, he didn't bother memorialising his other family members, such as Prince Henry or Queen Anne. To do so, I suppose, would have gained him nothing dynastically. As for why there was never any monument or even a plaque to record where he was buried, that was the fault of his son Charles I, who, having spent a fortune on the funeral, declined to blow any more on a monument, though he spent £3,000 having his father immortalised in a Rubens painting in the ceiling of the banqueting house in London. I hope you enjoyed that look at the death, burial, loss and rediscovery of James VI and I. Let me know below if you think Dean Stanley should have gone searching for James, even though it meant disturbing so many graves, or if the whole thing was a disrespectful waste of time. For your next hit of History Calling, might I suggest a video on another famous royal tomb in Westminster Abbey, or if you want to stick with the Stuarts, check out my playlist on this famous royal house. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.